Okay, welcome back to this exhaustive, extensive look into Blender. I'm going to be covering all of the different aspects of Blender, so this is a little bit different from more of my typical videos. Instead of jumping straight into topics and trying to make it as condensed and brief as possible, what I'm basically trying to do here is more of a long-term brain transfer of just a lot of information. And so naturally, we have to take our time. We have to go through things very thoroughly and talk through things. So this is a little bit different. If you just want to get little small snippets of information, there are thousands of videos out there that you can go to. The problem a lot of beginners have, and more intermediate users even, is when you're taking that learning approach, you have a little bit of information from this person and a little bit from this person, and you're just picking up little tiny bits at a time. And the problem with that is it's not actually very efficient, because 10 different people will show you the same thing, and you have to watch 100 videos to start to get to some information that no one else has shown you. Rather than take that route, I'm going to sit down and I'm going through things very methodically and spending a lot of time just talking to you, talking through things so I don't overlap. We've already shown you navigation and interface and, creating and deleting basic objects in Blender. That's all covered now, so we don't have to reiterate that with every video. We're past that, and now we can build on the foundation that we already have. So with that said, before we get going in today's video, well, this is part of getting going, let's set ourselves up right now and let's just talk about 3D production in general. So 3D production, regardless of what industry you're in, basically involves a few steps that don't change. So let me just list those out, and I'm just thinking of these on the fly, so we may add to these and kind of rearrange them. But to start, we have something called concept art. Now, whether you think you need concepts or not, you need concepts. Before we can create something in 3D, we need to have a concept of what it is we're making, or else we're going to spend a lot of efforts in areas we don't need to, and we're going to end up redoing our work and things like that. So concepts don't have to just be fantasy concepts. They don't have to be things that don't exist. In this category, I'm also going to put reference, because whether it's creating something that doesn't exist and it's from imagination, or it's something that does exist in the world, we need to get an idea for what that is. So first step is concept art or reference. The next thing we do typically is a process called modeling. Now, modeling is where we create objects or different shapes, characters, whatever it is we're creating with the 3D geometry. So I'm going to go through in depth that process and some different techniques that we can use. Then we have something called UV unwrapping. This is a concept I'll go into more depth on, of course, but just as a broad overview, UVs are the way we get flat 2D textures onto a 3D surface. So UV is just like XYZ. It's just two letters. Since XYZ was already taken, we use UV. So UV stands for two directions and two dimensions. And we take these two dimensions and map them onto a 3D object. We do this through a process called UV unwrapping. It's kind of like taking a 3D object, cutting lines into it, cutting seams, we call them, and then unwrapping it. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but you should be aware of that. Then there is texturing. Now this is a big topic. It involves a lot of subtopics, but basically texturing is where we give attributes to the surface of a particular surface, a material. And those attributes can be simple, something like just a mug, for example. That's pretty simple. There's a little bit of a gradient here. It goes from darker to lighter, but it's a fairly simple color. We're not just accounting for the color on things, we're also accounting for things like how reflective or smooth, glossy the surface is. We're also accounting for whether it's metallic or transparent. These are all attributes and things that we'll get into. But texturing, big topic. We'll talk about the big things there. Within texturing, there is a workflow called the PBR workflow. That stands for physically based rendering. Physically based rendering. Okay, I was right. I just lost confidence in that. Physically based rendering, that is where we have different maps that define different attributes of a surface. So like I was talking about before, we have like metalness, how metallic or dielectric it is. We have glossiness, whether it's rough or glossy. And there's just a lot we can get into within Blender itself. And the good thing is these principles apply outside of Blender. So if you move into something like Unreal Engine or Godot, you're making a game, these various principles that I'm talking about here apply. These are broad 3D production principles. Okay, moving forward, we texture, and these aren't necessarily in perfect order because now I'm going to talk about one called rigging. And this typically happens after texturing if you're going to animate something, but it just depends on your pipeline. These could be switched down a little bit. Switched around a little bit. Now, rigging is a step we take before animation. Rigging is basically putting joints and bones, we call them armatures, inside of a 3D model to move it around. This counts for character animation. It also accounts for, non-character objects that just have moving parts. You can rig those as well. So rigging is something we can get into. And then, of course, we have animation, where I'll go over some basics of animation in Blender, as well as some intermediate things like drivers. Drivers are something, we'll talk about that when we get there, but basically you can use one object to drive another object's motion, which is really, really useful. That's probably more in the rigging category. But anyway, rigging and animation, those go hand in hand. You can do these things in Blender. Also, though, these are principles that apply outside of Blender in any 3D package, but I'll cover them in Blender specifically. Okay, so we have reference, concept, modeling, UV unwrapping, texturing, rigging, animation. Then we have lighting. This is something we're going to go in depth on, not just what looks good with your lighting, but how to optimize your lighting in a scene to make sure your render times are fast, which brings us to our last one, which is rendering. Now in Blender, we typically use a path tracer called cycles. Path tracing is a computer's way of figuring out what light looks like in our 3D environment, and it's really, really useful. We can use a path tracer to get very realistic results. We can also take more of a stylized approach and kind of cheat some physical, real-world things to look more the direction that we want to take things. So these are all attributes of rendering, and we'll get into that as well. Now, like I said, these apply to whatever you're working on. Now that we've gone over the various steps and parts of production, let's actually take a closer look at how we can jump into our own production. So I'm just going to talk briefly about concept art and reference because this is a little bit more project specific, where we're going to find reference for a particular project. Just know that this is an important step and you shouldn't skip it. Now, for my purposes, I'm showing you some tools, and so I'm not going to necessarily go look for a specific reference because I'm not creating something specifically from the real world or trying to match concepts. I'm just teaching you some tools for now. So let's go ahead and get started with some modeling in Blender. Now, as I showed you last time, we got to this point right here where we rendered this monkey head and we added a light to the scene, and that was all good. Now, one thing that was different is you had a black background, I think. I don't think that was transparent. So this was more or less our result from last time. Now, let's actually talk about how we build custom shapes, because all we've done so far, press Shift A to add, and we added various mesh types. But there's so much more we can do. Of course, you're not just going to build scenes out of cubes and spheres, but you're going to actually get into making your own unique shapes. So let's just delete everything in our scene. So if you remember, A for select all, X for delete. Now I'm going to move our N and our T toolbars out of the way just so we see what we're doing here. And let's go ahead and add a cube. So Shift A to add a cube. And this cube is what we call a mesh. It could also be called an object. This cube could be moved around our scene with G. It could be rotated and it can be scaled. But how do we change the actual shape of things? How do we build this into a custom shape? And while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to insert a little chapter here called modifiers, which is something I'll cover in a second. But back to modeling. How do we start to change the shape of this? Well, in 3D, we know we have 3 dimensions. Every object or mesh in 3D is made up of 3 components. So those components are points or vertices, edges, and faces. An edge is just 2 points that are connected together. That connection is called an edge. And then a face is the surface that goes in between multiple points and multiple edges. So this cube right now has points on these corners. It has edges where the points are connected. And then it has faces where each 4 points are made up into one face. And because there are 4 points, that face is called a quad. If there were 3 points, it would be called a tri or a triangle. And if there's anything more than 4 points, it's called an n-gon. That's a term that we saw in our last video, but now you know what it means. It just means a face with more than 4 faces. It could be any number of points. More than 4 points. It could be any number of points. So that's the theory behind how this cube is constructed, but let's actually look at how it's constructed. Now, in your top left, we are in something called object mode. Object mode is where we're just taking an overview look at an object. We're moving it around, placing it in our scene. If you click on this, you can go down into edit mode. There are all sorts of different modes, but right now we're just talking about edit mode. In edit mode, you can start to see different points, edges, and faces. And right now, next to edit mode, we have our selection modes. We have point, edge, and face. If you look at these, you can even hold down Shift and have a few of them selected at once. But we have points, edges, and faces. Let's go to point mode first, and we can click on these various points, and you see that they're highlighted and selected. We can hold down Shift, and we can select a few of them. Next, we have edges. Same principle, but now it's just the edges in this cube. And then, of course, we have faces where we could just select the faces. You're going to be switching back and forth between object mode and edit mode all the time. It's one of your most used functions. So, of course, if we have something that's very frequently used, we want to learn the shortcut for this. So the shortcut to switch between object and edit mode is the tab key. And again, that has less to do with the fact that it's the tab key and more to do with the positioning of the tab key on your keyboard. Again, it's in that vertical left-hand column, something we talked about in our last video, and it's just very accessible and you can find it without even looking down at your keyboard. So tab key is how you switch between object mode, where you're just placing things, and edit mode, where we're starting to edit the components. Sometimes this is called component mode. We're editing the points, the edges, and the faces. So let's start editing them. Now, I said before you can switch between points, edges, and faces by just clicking up here. You can also just press 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard. 1 for point, 2 for edge, 3 for faces. And that's something you should get used to doing very quickly. Now, we can select different components just by left clicking on them. And we can also move them around and rotate them in the same way that we rotated and moved things or transformed things in object mode. It's the same shortcuts. We could also bring up our T for the tool panel over here. Just press the T key, where you can get your gizmos that you should be familiar with from our last video. Or like I worked in our last video, you could just use the shortcuts. So let's grab 2 points here just by selecting one, shift selecting another, and let's try a few things. Let's try G for grab. You can grab that and move it around. You can right click or press escape to cancel out of that movement. R for rotate, and again, the first time you press R, it'll be rotating according to where your view is. If you double tap R, it'll enter into more of a free rotation here. We can hold down shift to fine tune what we're doing. And then the last one is S for scale, and we can combine these with those keys that we had in our last video, X, Y, and Z for the different axes. So for example, we can go G for grab and then Z to grab this and move it only on the vertical Z axis or the Y axis or the X axis. This is kind of the basics of manipulating objects or mesh in Blender. Now this manipulation, this is called modeling, and this is where we really start to create things. Of course, we have way more flexibility than just grabbing points and edges and faces and moving them around and scaling them. We need to actually create new geometry and to delete geometry. So now let's talk about creating and deleting geometry and the various tools that we have for affecting this mesh. So one of the very first ones I'm going to talk about is extrusion. Now, think of this like you're working with clay, and we're going to build more clay on top of this cube. We're going to extrude it up so that we have more to work with. Of course, we could just grab this face and grab it and move it up on the Z axis. That's just moving our clay here, as you can picture it. But what if we actually build more on top of it? That is called extruding. And to extrude, we just press E key, E for extrude. Very easy to remember. So if we press E, you can see that it has automatically locked to the Z axis. If you don't want it to lock to the Z axis, you could just press Z and that'll stop that locking. It just locked to that Z axis because it was trying to predict what we were trying to do, and so it locked it on Z. You could press Z, get rid of that lock, and we can extrude this. Now, if we left click to confirm this, what you see is instead of just moving that existing face upwards, we've extruded, and that's allowed us to come off in this other direction. We're starting to create an actual shape of something. We can rotate this new face. We can lock it to an axis when we rotate. I'm not being very scientific or precise about anything right now, just because I'm going to be showing you a few different tools. We can extrude that again. We can extrude, and this time it's locking on what's called a local axis. So a global axis is something that's always true. Z is always straight up and down. That's always true, regardless of what object you're working on. A local axis is going to have a Z-axis that's local to what's called a normal. A normal is the direction that a particular face is facing. So when I extruded this, Blender automatically tried to guess that I wanted to extrude on my local Z-axis. So it's going out at this perfect angle where it's totally straight because it's extruding at the normal distance or the normal angle of the first initial face that was down here. Now we could press Z again to get out of that local axis. And if we press Z one more time, now we're extruding on the global Z axis. If that's confusing, don't worry, it'll start to make sense. Let me show you a little menu where you can start to grasp some of these concepts though. So let's click to finalize that extrusion. Let me just take a drink of my tea here. Okay, so at the top here, we have a few different menus that we're going to go through. The reason this is top and center is because it's very, very frequently used. So right here, we have what's called a transformation orientation. And right now, it's set to global. That's, like I said, it's always true regardless of what object you're working on. There's always a z-axis for your global scene, there's always an x-axis, and there's always a y-axis. Right now, and by default, this is set to global. We could also set it to something like local. So first, let's just do global. We'll take this face, let's grab, press Z, and this is the global Z direction. If we press X, that's the global X and Y direction. This is true no matter what you're doing. If we grab this and change this to local, this actually won't change because if we just extrude on the Z axis here, this is the orientation of this object has not changed. If I were to go back to object mode and rotate this on Z 90 degrees, and then I'm still in local here, I go to extrude this, and let's say I want to extrude it on X. Notice that the world X direction is left to right kind of on my screen here, but the local X direction is front to back. That's because I rotated the object, and now locally this object's local axis is a little bit different. Hopefully that makes sense. This is going to be something that it might take a few projects to click. So if you don't know what I'm talking about right now, if this hasn't clicked for you, don't stress. This is something that's going to take iteration. You're not going to understand everything I say the first time I say it. This is something we're going to have to come back to. And it might be 3 videos from now, we're modeling something and you go, oh, I get it. I finally understand what the heck Riley was talking about when he was talking about global and local orientation. But just know for now, local behaves a little bit differently from global if your object is not in the same orientation as this global axis, as it is here, because the global is left to right, this red line, but our local x-axis was a little bit different. Okay, enough of that. Let me go back and let's talk about a few others. Now, normal, you can hover over these and read up on them. A normal, like I mentioned before, is the direction of a particular face. So in Blender, we have a little icon here that tries to show you what's going on. We have a face there and we have an arrow. Now, if I have it set to normal and I extrude, and even if I press Z to get out of that initial lock and I press Z again, it's now locked, extruding upwards, Z, on this normal orientation. So whatever direction this face was facing, let me rotate it in a weird way. If I extrude on its normal orientation, it's always going to extrude in the same orientation as that initial normal face, if that makes sense. So I think I can turn on normals here for you so you can actually see what I'm talking about. That might be helpful. Yeah, so under this menu, your viewport overlays, under your mesh edit overlays, we have normals right here, and you can display normals, and that'll give you a little line that's showing you the direction that each face is facing. And this is called our normals. So when we have our transform orientation set to normal, when I do something like extrude, it will always lock to that normal when I press something like Z to extrude on the Z axis. The transform orientation is oriented to that particular face's normal direction. Normals might be something that takes a minute to understand, but that's the basics of it. All the information is there for you. So let's go ahead and turn off our normals, and we're not going to cover these other ones. This may be something that we get into, but just so you know, 9 times out of 10, I'm keeping it on global. Every now and then I turn it to local, and once in a blue moon I'll turn it to normal. So, but now at least you know what's going on there. We also have a transform pivot point. So in 3D, when we're grabbing something or rotating or scaling, that's called transforming. We looked at our transform orientation. This is our transform pivot point. So a pivot point is the point at which an object pivots. I probably didn't need to say that. It's pretty self-evident. Let me just take an object that's sitting on my desk here, this Xbox controller, and let's picture this is in Blender and we're rotating it. Now, if the pivot point is in the center, I can grab my two fingers here and I'll hold it from the center and it will rotate on that pivot point. It's pivoting from that point. If the pivot point was over here on this side and I rotated, it's going to rotate in a different way because the pivot point is over here rather than in the center. The pivot point is important when you're working with 3D objects. If I go back to object mode with tab, we have our pivot point, which is this little orange dot right here. It's not the red and white one. That's something that's different that we'll get into. But it's just this little orange dot. So if I rotate this, you'll notice it's pivoting from that little orange dot. And in edit mode, it's the same thing. If I rotate this face, it's rotating from the center of that face. That's the pivot point. If I grab a few faces, it's going to calculate the center of that pivot point or the center of that selection. And right now, the transform pivot point is set to median point. So that's what I mean when I said it's going to try to find the middle of that, the center of that. So right now it's set to median point. There are also some different options we have here. I'll just go down the list here. Bounding box center is similar to the median point. It's just a different way of calculating the center, which is something I don't really use, but you could play around with. Then we have our 3D cursor. Now I mentioned we have this little red and white circle here. This is what's called the 3D cursor. If we're pivoting from the 3D cursor and I rotate this, now you could see it gives us a little dotted black line that's connecting what we're moving with the pivot point down here. Now we're rotating all the way from that 3D cursor as the pivot point. And you can actually move the 3D cursor around in your scene. So this 3D cursor is actually pretty handy for things like this. To move the 3D cursor, just shift and right click. We can move it out here, for example, and that changes the pivot point of that particular rotation. By the way, it's not just rotation, it works for scaling as well. If there's nothing under your 3D cursor when you place it, it'll kind of just place it out randomly in space. If you shift right click and you have an object underneath where your 3D cursor is, it'll snap it to wherever your mouse was over that object. So now we can quickly change that pivot point by shift right clicking, changing the 3D cursor, and that's kind of a non-precise, easy way to change the pivot point as you work, is to set that to 3D cursor. You can also transform your pivot point from individual origins. Now this starts to get interesting when we have various faces selected. Let's go to median point, and if we scale, you could see it's scaling all of that down. Let me select one random one over here, just according to the median point. If I had this set to individual origins and I scaled, notice how it behaves a little bit differently, and it's scaling each selection as if it was the only selection that existed, okay? And it's the same thing with rotation, it's just a little bit different. You also have median point, as you know, that's one we've already talked about. And then we have active element. In our last video, you remember me talking about selecting multiple objects, and when you select a lot of objects, they all become highlighted in orange, but the last selected object is yellow, and that's your active object. You can only have one active object even if you have many things selected. And it's the same exact thing in edit mode. When I selected these multiple faces, we have these orange faces and they're highlighted in the orange outline, but only one of them is kind of this white highlight, and that is our active element. So now if we have our transform pivot point set to active element, and we rotate, it will pivot around the last selected, most recently selected active element. And that is true for face selection mode. It's also true for something like point selection mode. If I made this my active element by selecting it last, then I rotate and that becomes my pivot point. Now this is a really, really crucial and important thing to understand. So for example, if I wanted to rotate this face and have this edge act as a hinge, as a pivot point, then I could change this to active element. I can make sure that's the last face that was selected, and then I can rotate, and that becomes, oh, let's make sure active element, and that kind of becomes the hinge for the rotation. Now it's kind of hard to see right now because we're set to a global transform orientation. If we set that to our normal direction, we can then integrate both of these concepts. We can rotate on the normal of this particular face and the angle which it's facing, which is not our seen global rotation, right? This is kind of skewed at a strange angle. So we could set this to normal, we could set this to active element, and now we can actually R for rotate, press Y, and we can use that one edge as a hinge to rotate on. We could also use it as a hinge to scale on, and all sorts of things. So hopefully you're starting to grasp the importance of these two menus. This is something that not a lot of people will take the time to sit down and teach you and try to get you to understand how it works. A lot of Blender users today that are modeling, getting paid for it, don't understand what these things are. They never touch them. They kind of just hack their way through a project and they make it work, credit to them. But it's really important to understand these concepts to make your work more efficient. And so you understand how to get around and how to actually change things that you want to have expected behavior as you work. So that's a look at transform orientation and transform pivot points in our edit mode. Let's change this back to some defaults. Let's go to median point and let's work from a global orientation. And let's just continue as we're working over the list here. So this next one is our snapping menu. And snapping, just like any creative software, we can snap to certain increments and we can snap to various different attributes of our model here, which is really, really powerful. We can turn on snapping by clicking this little magnet icon, and you can imagine why it's a magnet, because you get close enough to something and it's just gonna snap like a magnet. It's gonna pull you to a predictable place. Now, I don't typically turn on snapping because whenever you're working in your scene, you can hold down Control to temporarily snap. So by default, Blender will snap to what's called the grid. When you look at your 3D scene, we have these squares. This is a unit of measurement. Each square is actually 1 meter by default. So when we grab and hold down Control to snap, it's snapping around on a 3D grid by 1 meter. We can change what we're snapping to in the snapping menu. So right now we have increment. So my apologies, it wasn't grid. We were snapping by increment, which is similar. It's snapping in our measurements. Or we can snap to the actual grid, which will snap it to the exact 1 meter or whatever your grid is set to measurements. Then we have vertex snapping, which is going to snap to those points. We have edge snapping, we have face snapping, volume, edge center, and edge perpendicular. Now, the main ones I use are vertex, edge, face, and every now and then grid, if I'm building like a modular game environment, for example. But let's just look at what this snapping looks like in actual practice. Now, what we could do is instead of just selecting one, we can hold down Shift and we can select a few of these. So we can snap to edges, vertex, and face all at the same time. And What this is going to do, it's going to snap to the closest. You can also snap to the center, the median, or the active. This is something that will make sense as we work. Let's just leave it at the closest for now so I can kind of show you what we're doing. Okay, so now we can snap to various elements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab just one point and we're going to extrude this one point. Then we're going to hold down Control to start snapping. Now, if you're not hovering over anything to snap to, it's not going to make a difference. But what we could do is hold down Control and we can start to hover over various elements. So remember how I have a mix of things here. I have vertex, edge, and face. Let me just delete that vertice. I'll show you how to delete in a moment. Let's press E for extrude. We can snap to an edge. You see that little box forms around an edge to show you we're snapping to an edge, or a vertex, sorry. We can also snap to an edge. It shows us a little hourglass symbol to show us we're snapping to an edge. And if we go over a face, it shows us a little circle graphic to show us we're snapping to a face. So we have square for vertex, hourglass for edge, and a little circle for a face. And that is an easy way for us to snap to different components on our mesh. Now, this wasn't a very practical example of snapping. You're not really going to extrude a point and snap it to that face, but I just wanted to show you the snapping menu and give you a brief introduction, something we'll go into more depth later. Now, I told you I'd tell you how to delete components, so let's extrude one. To delete that particular vertex, we're in vertex selection mode. All you have to do is press X, and we get a little delete menu because it matters how you delete this. Because we're in component mode, it's a little bit more in depth than just deleting a whole object and the whole object disappears. We can choose what part of this component we want to delete. Because this is just a single vertex, it doesn't really matter. We delete vertex and it's going to get rid of that whole selected vertex. We also have edges, faces, only faces, and then we get into dissolving things. So what are we talking about here? Let's delete that vertex and let me start talking about something called a loop to explain a little bit more about deleting. So go to edge mode with 2. And as you model, we model with these components and they build up faces and they also build up what are called edge loops. So to select an edge loop, just hold down Alt and click on one of these edges down at the base here. And what it's done is it select a whole loop of edges. And what we could do is we can grab that, we can delete it, we can do whatever we want. Now, if I just press X and I delete vertices, that's going to totally get rid of all of those vertices that are in the middle there. So everything kind of disappears. What we could do is we can choose to dissolve just those edges. So what dissolving does is a little bit different. Instead of deleting, what it does is it keeps the connection between these edges and the edges down here, and it just kind of forgets that this edge ever existed. It dissolves and ceases to exist, but the connections remain. So if we dissolve edges, you can see how that functionality is a little bit different. The shortcut for dissolve edges, instead of pressing X and going down this menu, is you could just press Control X. So if we Alt select another edge loop, we can start to dissolve these various loops. So there is a difference in edit mode between deleting and dissolving. And it's important to understand how deleting different components affects the mesh. So let's go to face mode with 3. Let's select this face. And if we were to delete the vertices, it's not just going to delete this one face, it's deleting this vertex and this vertex. And if you think about it, this little vertex right now is not just used by this one face. This vertex is shared by this face and this face and this face. This one little guy makes up a lot of geometry. So if we go back to face mode, select that face, hit X and delete that vertex, we've lost a huge chunk of our mesh because those vertices were being shared for so many different faces. So go ahead and press Control Z. This is where we can get into just deleting things like edges or faces. Now, if I just delete this face, that might be the functionality you were expecting. We just get rid of that face, but that vertice still exists because it's being used for these surrounding faces. Let's Control Z. So you can play around with these different options here. You can collapse things, but the main things here is I want you to grasp the concept of deleting different attributes here, or deleting different components, vertices, edges, or faces, and how that matters and how that affects depending on what you actually want to delete. So if you want to delete vertices, that's going to get rid of the most fundamental building block, and that's going to delete the most. If I delete edges, that's going to delete a little bit less, but we still had edges that were being used for other faces, so those faces will also disappear. Or if you want to get really specific and say just delete this face, then it will just delete that one face. Okay, so we've talked about some very basic kind of edit mode modeling. We've gone into grab, scale, and rotate. We've gotten into vertices, edges, and faces. We've talked about transform orientation modes as well as transform pivot points. We've talked a little bit about snapping. Now let's cover this last little option up here, which is called proportional editing. Now this is how we kind of get a soft effect as we move faces or edges or points around in our mesh. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Let me press 1 to go to vertex selection mode, and let's just select one vertex, just a random one, maybe this one. And we can grab this, and when we grab that, it's only going to grab that one specific vertex. What we could do is we can come up here, the shortcut is just the O key, or you can come up and click this to turn it on. This turns on proportional editing. And what this does is instead of just influencing this one vertex, this one point, when we press G, we have a sphere of influence. If I use my scroll wheel, I can grow or shrink that sphere. And now, as you see, there's kind of a fall off effect on the surrounding points as well. So this is how we can influence our neighboring points, not just the one that's selected, and we can increase or decrease the influence of that. Let me show you a little bit more of an extreme example. So I'm going to come back to this. Let me just turn it off. Let's go back to object mode though. Let's press X and let's just delete that whole object. And let's add a new plane. Something unexpected is going to happen because we moved around. Remember our little 3D cursor here? The 3D cursor we used as kind of a pivot point when we were editing, but now, believe it or not, the 3D cursor is kind of like a portal where objects enter the scene. So if I hit Shift A and I add a plane, that plane has entered the scene at this unexpected spot. It's not entering at the scene origin, but it's entering at the 3D cursor. Now this is a functionality that you'll get used to, and once you master this, you can use the 3D cursor to import things in your scene, because maybe you're working all the way over here and you want to import whatever it is you're working on. You want to import an object where you're working, but it could be unexpected and this is now floating out in space. So let's delete that plane. How do we get our 3D cursor back to the center of the world origin if we've accidentally moved it around by Shift right clicking? To do that is very simple. Just go press Shift S. Again, it has less to do with the fact that this is the S button and more to do with the fact that this is a convenient button to press. It does stand for the snapping menu, so if it helps you to remember S for snapping. But basically, this is how you move around your origins and your 3D cursor. So what we could do is Shift S, and we could just go cursor to world origin. And what that's going to do is reset the cursor back to that world origin. So that is just a quick action you could do. You could also do something like cursor to selected or cursor to active, all sorts of stuff. But for right now, let's just do cursor to world origin. Then let's hit Shift A and let's add our plane. And now let's just talk about one more edit mode function. So let's go to edit mode. And I want to show you how to add what's called a loop cut. So a loop cut is, remember the loop that we had around our cube earlier? We can add more loops to an object with Control R. Now with Control R, what that's going to do is it's going to give you this little yellow line preview, and all this is you're showing Blender which direction you want to add loop cuts, because there are two different directions we can add loop cuts right here. If you change your mind, you don't want to add a loop cut, then you could just press escape or right click. But we do want to add a loop cut, so let's go Control R, and let's tell it we want to add a loop cut in this direction. So now left click, but we're not done yet. We've told it which direction, now we're telling it where we want to place this loop cut. So we can kind of place this wherever we want, and we could try to eyeball this to put it in the middle, but if we want it perfectly in the middle, all we need to do right now is just right click. Again, right click is kind of where we cancel out of something. So we've already confirmed that we are going to place a loop cut, and then we're in the middle of deciding where it's going to be placed. But if we right click, it just says, okay, never mind, just put it in the center. Okay, so one more time, just because that's a little bit confusing. Control R for loop cut, select the direction we want to do that loop cut, and then right click to put that in the center. Now let's do that again for the other direction. So we'll say this direction, left click, and then right click to throw it into the center. Now let's do some practice. Select that loop cut. So if you just select one edge, that's going to select one of them. If you hold down Alt and left click, that selects that loop cut. If you do Shift Alt click, that will select the loop cut in the other direction. And the reason I want you to do that is because we're going to dissolve them. So remember, you can press X and come down to dissolve edges, or you could just press Control X and that will dissolve those. That's different from deleting the vertices, which will delete everything because those vertices are shared all over the place. So Control X to dissolve those, and instead this time we're going to add multiple loops. So press Control R one more time. This is the direction I want my loop cut to be, but this time let's use the scroll wheel to scroll up, and let's add a few loop cuts. Specifically, let's add 5. So now left click and right click just to have those in the center. If you want to change after the fact the amount of loop cuts, we can come down here to our little menu. If you lose that menu, you can press F9. This is just the last operation menu. We kind of went over this in the first video. We can increase the number of loop cuts. I do want this to be an odd number because I want there to be a center line. If this was even, for example, then you could see that we don't have a center line, but there's a face in the center. So I want to have maybe 15 loop cuts on that direction, and the factor is where it exists, either negative or positive. We right clicked and set that in the middle, which sets the factor to 0. So you can always come back and change these options for your last operation, but let's do the same thing in this other direction. So Control R, we'll select that direction, and oops, I forgot to use the scroll wheel. That's fine. Let's just right click. We have our previous operation. The last one, we did 15 on the other direction. So let's keep it even. Let's do 15 on this direction. So now we have this plane that has all of these internal vertices and edges. And the reason I did this is I wanted to show you that proportional editing tool in even more detail. So let's turn on proportional editing. Remember, the shortcut was O, or you could just come up here and press the button. And let's grab this and move it up on Z. And you could see if we scroll in here, we have this sphere of influence, which is really helping us get this cool, nice, even effect. Now we can actually change the shape of this proportional fall off. You can change it in your previous operation right here, or let's Control Z. That's what this drop down is for. We can choose from a few presets here. We have a smooth fall off. We have a sphere fall off. I'll try to say that 5 times fast. We have a root fall off. You could just play with what each of these do, but the pictures give you a pretty good, the pictures, oh, I did it twice. The pictures give you a pretty good indication of what it's gonna do. We have a sharp fall off. We have linear fall off, kind of like a pyramid. We have a constant fall off, which is more like a plateau. And finally, we have a random fall off, which is going to be totally random. It'll randomize the influence of that fall off for each little point within the sphere of influence. So that's proportional editing. That is an introduction to another handy tool in editing called the loop cut tool, which is gonna be something you use all over the place. Let me show you one more, maybe 2 more tools, and then we'll call this video good. I think we're over an hour now. Let's add a cube to our scene. Let's go to edit mode. Let's go to face selection mode. Let's select this top face. And I want to show you what's called the Inset tool. The Inset tool, believe it or not, is just I for Inset. If you press I, you can see it insets. It creates a face within the face, and that can be very useful. If we were then to do something like extrude, we could extrude in on itself, inset, extrude, inset, extrude, inset, extrude. You get the idea, hopefully, of how these tools work. Inset and extrude are 2 tools that work very well together. The opposite of inset is something called an outset tool. So let's select this loop of faces with Alt left click. If we hit inset, we're insetting all of those faces. If we hit I again, we're going to change the functionality and we're insetting on individual faces. So I once is just insetting everything together. I twice insets on individual faces, which could be kind of this cool effect here if we extrude that down. But what about outset? If I hit I and then I hit O, so hit I first. And if you forget this, by the way, look at the bottom of my screen here. You can see it has a few options for what we could do. On the very, very bottom left, it has the enter key and left click, and it says, this is to confirm. This is what I've been telling you, left click to confirm. Next to that, it says escape or right click will cancel. Again, I've been telling you this. The control key, if we hold that down, tweaks things, okay? So we inset and we can hold down control and we can tweak where that face is insetting. So that's very, very useful. Thank you, Blender, for telling us that. It also says we can press the O key for outset. So what is that? Let's try it out. Let's press O, and now we have this interesting functionality where we are outsetting instead of insetting. We're creating an edge loop around our selection instead of within our selection. You would be amazed at how many people do not know this exists. It says it right there at the bottom of the screen. It shows you, not just for this tool, by the way, anytime you use a shortcut, it'll show you kind of your combination shortcuts underneath that you can press to add to your current shortcut. We also have, again, I for individual. We already knew that one. We pressed I twice. And then we have B for boundary, which isn't going to do anything in this case, but we may have the opportunity to use that at another stage in this course. So just wanted to show you that little menu down there. We've gone over E for extrusion. We've gone over Control R for loop cuts. We've gone over I for inset. And now you know you have some combination classes. By the way, when you press E for extrude, just look at all of those buttons at the bottom there, things that you can combine with this particular function. So always keep your eyes on the bottom of the screen. You'd be surprised at what you can learn and what you can do if you combine shortcuts. But those are some basic ones. Again, that's E for extrude. We covered Control R for loop cut, and we covered I for inset, as well as outset, individual faces, all that good stuff. Okay, that is probably enough for this one video. We're a little bit over an hour. This isn't everything that we're going to get into with modeling in Blender. This is just the surface. We haven't really made anything cool yet. We've kind of pushed around some cubes, and we'll get some more intentional results as we go. I just wanted to start by showing you the very, very basic kind of broad overview of what modeling is. In the next video, we're going to get more specific with modeling. We're going to make something very intentional and specific from reference. Within that process, we're going to get into something called modifiers, which is a really, really powerful tool that's not unique to Blender. Some other 3D packages have it, but Blender does it really well. Modifiers are kind of a procedural workflow, which if you don't know what that means, you're going to understand in the next video. Beyond that, like I said, this is a very long-term course, so we're going to be getting into things like texturing and lighting and animation and rendering, just everything. Now, I know I said in my last class that everything going forward would be on my Patreon. I decided to give you another free course, and I may continue to offer these for free, but at some point, just please understand that I need to make a living. I need to make money as I spend my time doing this. So just consider going and supporting my Patreon. In addition to some in-depth trainings over there, I also have 3D asset libraries that you get access to when you subscribe, and I definitely try to make it worth the $3 or $5 a month that you contribute. So please consider supporting the Patreon. In addition to access to all the 3D assets and everything, you also get access to a private Discord server where you can ask me directly, not just questions, but you can, I've had people post blend files and say, hey, I'm having a problem. I can't figure this out. Can you please take a look at my file for me? And I'll then take that file. A lot of times I'll just do a whole tutorial, a whole personalized tutorial for you, where I'll look at your problem and I won't just fix it for you, but I'll teach you how I fixed it and the principles that you need to understand to avoid similar problems in the future. So yeah, please consider going over supporting me. It's patreon.com/RileyB3D. I promise I'm doing everything I can to make it worth your money and make it worth your while. All right, that's it for basic modeling tools. This is kind of the last boring video, I'd say. I'm gonna keep it at a slow pace, but the good news is you're starting to understand enough concepts that we can actually start to put them together and make some pretty cool stuff. So I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for checking this one out. And again, please go check out the Patreon. I'm trying to make it worth your time, and hopefully I'll get enough support so I can keep this series going. So thanks, and I'll see you on the next in-depth Blender training.